And welcome to the 45th Toronto International Film Festival's Industry Conference. Thanks for joining us live at Bell Digital Talks. As a reminder, this conversation will be available tomorrow on TIFF Digital Cinema Pro as well for anyone who missed it. My name is Cameron Bailey. I'm the co-head and artistic director here at TIFF. And as you join us today for this talk and everything we do at the festival, we really do encourage you to reflect on the land that you're on, who the traditional keepers of that land are, what the treaty relationship is, or if it's unceded territory. Here in Toronto, we're located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. And this territory is within the lands that are protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, and it's home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We're grateful to work on this land. I, as someone who came to this country, a product of colonialism, but a settler, I am grateful to offer whatever support I can for Indigenous voices on this land as well. And that's part of what we're doing at the festival, and it's part of what we're doing here today. I want to thank some of the people and organizations who make what we do at TIFF possible. Our lead sponsor is Bell. Our major sponsors are RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa. And our major industry supporters are Telefilm Canada and Ontario Creates. It's a real pleasure to introduce this next session, co-presented by our partners at Imaginative, which will address one of the most crucial and long-standing issues facing the film industry, cultural theft under colonialism, by underscoring the need for and discussing the practice of telling Indigenous stories through an authentic lens, featuring 4 Indigenous filmmakers and industry professionals from around the world, and moderated by the artistic director of Imaginative, Nikki Little. I'll just say that this is kind of a groundbreaking thing for us at TIFF. I first heard about the term narrative sovereignty from someone who used to work here, Jesse Wente, who's now the head of the Indigenous Screen Office in Canada and really one of the leading figures in Indigenous screen work and thinking in the country. And I learned a lot from understanding what that term means, where it comes from, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today as well. And I'm so glad that we've got Nikki to lead it, so please join me in welcoming Nikki Little.
Hi there, thanks for having me. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm so excited. Congratulations on the start of your festival. It's going to be incredible. I just know it. And I appreciate you having us co-present this discussion today. It's going to be really exciting, and I'm really looking forward to all the voices that we have here. So, as Cameron mentioned, I'm Nikki Little, Wapke Mayungan, and I'm the artistic director. I'm Anishinaabe from Kisigan-Wajing First Nation, which is in northern Manitoba, Canada. And today I'm logging in from Toronto, and as Cameron mentioned, is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I really do love hearing more and more about territories, and I just think, you know, Dish with One Spoon and thinking about reciprocity and, you know, especially grounding within the conversation today is a really, really great place to start. And do encourage you to think through that as you, wherever you may be logging in from today. As some of you may know, Imaginative is the largest presenter of Indigenous screen content. We're so happy to be here. We host an annual festival every October, and this year our festival is from the October 20th to 25th. So today I am thrilled to moderate this conversation as part of TIFF Perspectives around narrative sovereignty. And right away, we're going to have our panelists join us. So first off, we have Lyle Mitchell Corbin Jr. Hi, Lyle.
Hey, there I am. How are you guys?
Did you want to introduce yourself or say a few words?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a filmmaker. I've had a couple of shorts at Sundance and TIFF over the last few years. Thank you guys for the support. It's been really wonderful. I'm from I'm Ojibwe. I'm from the northern Wisconsin tribe of the Bad River Indian Reservation. And I've been making films for about 10 years now, and I actually owe it to Bird, who's about to be introduced as well.
Perfect. And then we also are joined by Tracy Deer. Let's see if she'll be popping up right now.
Hi.
Hello, Tracy. How are you?
Great. I'm
Excellent.
really excited about the discussion.
Did you want to say a few words about yourself?
Sure. A little bit about me. I'm a Mohawk writer, director, showrunner. I've been working in the business now for 20 years. My first 10 years were in documentary. Then I was in television, and I'm here at TIFF with my first feature, Beans, which is just so exciting. And I'm from Ganawage, which is located in Quebec. And I'm thrilled we're doing this conversation. So thanks for having me.
Amazing. So next we're going to be joined by Bird Running Water.
Buddy. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm good. As you said, my name's Bird Running Water. I belong to the Cheyenne and Mescalero Apache tribes, and I'm dialing in from the orange skies of Southern California, which we sit on the Gabriela Notongva unceded territory, as well as Tataviam lands as well. So it's very much an honor to be here. I serve as a director of Sundance Institute's Indigenous program, where I've been for the past 19 years.
Amazing. And then finally, we have finally Chelsea Winstanley joining us today. Hi, Chelsea.
Kia ora koutou katoa, na mihi nui kia koutou. Ko te tahe o tōku māma no Ngāti me Ngāti Rangi Nui, ko te taha tōku pāpa no Ngāti Pākehā. I'm dialing in from Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's very cold here, unlike the orange skies where you are, Bird. It's pretty makariri. But yeah, as a writer, director, and producer, I've had films at both TIFF and Imaginative and Sundance. So very grateful to be here today to, whakawhiti ngā kōrero. Thank you very much.
Perfect. So just a little bit housekeeping. If you, as a viewer here joining us today, if you have any questions, we'll be having a conversation for about 40 minutes. To the left of your screen, you will see a chat function where you can ask questions, and we have some moderators that will be able to bring us those questions for the last 10 minutes or so of our conversation. So today we're talking about narrative sovereignty and all the good things around that. And I just actually wanted to maybe begin the conversation a little bit with the word authenticity and authentic in relation to narrative sovereignty, and to get some perspectives around, do you think these words, like, do they necessarily mean the same thing, or can they exist separately? How about start with Bird?
Oh my God, I knew you were going to start with me. Well, my mind started racing because, I mean, I think it's kind of unfortunate that we have to declare and to define this terminology, because it's only really in reaction to the history of cinema, right? Mm-hmm. It's like the very first images that even Thomas Edison captured, whenever he was starting to create kind of these moving images, were of Native people dancing. And the ongoing, kind of world, I guess, of storytelling that's happened cinematically has always been, I think, rooted in the misrepresentation of not only Indigenous people, but also Black people as well, with the Birth of a Nation, the first feature film, which really is rooted around a point of view with the Ku Klux Klan. And so I think that after over 100 years of all of that, lack of authenticity and misrepresentation, it's kind of like we have to have these discussions, in order to kind of declare that I think we're declaring that, it's a new era, it's a new era of authenticity. And it's also a new era of, of some level of sovereignty and self-determination when it comes to, storytelling and image making, especially from an Indigenous point of view.
And I was wondering, Tracy, how about just from your perspective as well, if with your recent film, and it has real live events that happened, not only to yourself personally, but also within a really important historical context in Canada. What does, authenticity and narrative sovereignty, how do those relate to each other for you?
Well, I really like the word authenticity, and I do think that it'd be great if across the board, not even just with our storytelling, but across the board, why are we not all striving to tell authentic stories, that we as filmmakers have something to bring to the story? We're not just going to grab something and present it. What do we have to bring to it? And as Bird said, I think the history of cinema has not valued authenticity. It's been okay to tell any story you want. All of my work to date, I've been very blessed to be working for 20 years, and all of the stories I've told have been about my own community, whether that be very specific to my actual reserve or in a broader sense. And I do believe that the perspective that I bring adds layer upon layer upon layer to that story. And I do think there are many people that can tell fantastic stories, let's say about my current film, The Oka Crisis. There are hundreds of fabulous stories to be told about the Oka Crisis. But that belongs to us to tell, and not for somebody else to come in and create their own about it. So I think I completely lost the point of your question, but I do think I said something.
I think so too. And I think it's just interesting you kind of brought in a community element, which I think is quite key, where the story is rooted from and where you are in relation to that. And I was wondering, Chelsea, if you wouldn't mind speaking to that a little bit, just in terms of like where you come from within your practice, but as both maybe a producer and as a director, your relation not only to the story, but like around narrative sovereignty, if it's on behalf of the community or, that dynamic of how you put context between that.
Yeah, kia ora. For me, I think authenticity comes from intention, and perhaps the way in which, you go into a project or you start a project, really you have to think about what is your intention? Why are you involved in this? Why do you want to tell this story? What part of this resonates with you? And if, we're thinking about the history, like Bird said, it's often being told in a romantic or colonized way, or from the colonizer's perspective. And then therefore that authenticity is always going to be skewed towards their worldview. And I don't think their intention is perhaps the same as someone who's making that from an Indigenous perspective would do that. And then also when you bring in the kind of commodification of storytelling too, I think when we think about community and where we come from, it's a really hard, you're almost butting heads with what that means. For community, for Indigenous communities, it's quite hard to grapple with the idea of commodifying and making money out of something that's really a shared experience. So it's a hard one to grapple with, because you want to make sure that you have control over that story, because that's really important, and you want to make sure that you have that from the beginning to the very end. So I think it's really important for us when we go into a story that we're not just, I think we're past the point of, cultural advisor box tickers now. We've gone beyond that point, and we really have to make sure that we, as a community of Indigenous storytellers, we don't stand for that anymore. Like, we have to be a part of that project from the very beginning to the very end. And that means, conceptually to distribution even, because the way in which your film might be marketed could be completely different to the way in which you had intended it to be in the first place. So I feel like we just have to ensure and make sure we maintain that presence at every level across the board.
And around that, I was just wondering in terms of because that is quite endurance wise, thinking around that responsibility, do you have any strategies specifically that kind of help to engage, to ensure that there's engagement throughout?
Well, I think you have to be prepared to do a lot of community service, as an Indigenous storyteller, in terms of, don't think of it as a money-making thing. You just can't, because it's not about you in that moment. It's about the future generations. And I think that's something we all have in common. We're always making something, just trying to be part of a movement that'll hopefully allow the next generation to really be at the top of all those things. Strategy wise, having this global community and a dear friend to all of us, Mera Tamita, who made such an impact and made these connections for all of us to be able to share. We need each other. We're in community. It's that colonial thing, divide and conquer. They almost won that one, but they haven't. Look at us, we're here, and so long as we maintain these relationships, that we can always feed off each other and actually find those solutions together.
That's really great. Lyle, I was wondering if you could speak to your last two short films, actually, Shanab and Shanab Part 2, just in relation to narrative sovereignty and how you approached the shorts within the works there.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I also wanted to go off of what Chelsea was saying as well. I think a big piece of where we're going isn't necessarily about. I feel like not overvaluing, but like the stories are only so important. I think the storytellers and the artists are very important too, and getting to a point where the artists have the freedom to just tell their own, like to make the films the way that they want to make the films, and to have that kind of creative freedom within that storytelling space, to be able to shoot things the way that they want to shoot them, and to have performers do it. There's all the parts of the process that add up to a film. Having somebody, a native director, native screenwriter, being able to have an input on each part of that process is kind of where we should be heading, and I think it is where we're heading with these larger films. Like Taika obviously is a big example of somebody in the industry who's doing really well in that regard. But yeah, in terms of like my films, that's how I approach them as well. I've developed my own kind of language, and it's definitely using the language of other movies, and I was a huge fan of a lot of different films before I ever became a filmmaker, and those things definitely creep into the language and the vocabulary of what I do as a filmmaker as well. And I brought it recently to a feature. I just finished actually shooting less than a week ago my first feature, starring like Michael Grey Eyes and Francesca Spencer, Jesse Eisenberg, Kay Bosworth, and it was like I was given that freedom to be able to shoot it how I wanted to shoot it, and to have tell the story that I wanted to tell it. And it was, I think, the more that we get people involved in cinema in that like regard, where they have creative freedom, they can really affect because then it doesn't come from a political perspective. Then it's just them telling the stories the way that they want to tell them.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of like occupying space, or like in what you're sort of talking about, I was wondering if anyone could speak to a little bit of the work of frontrunners that had come before you. And I think of Alanis and Merita, and so who have been people for you that have sort of helped make the way for narrative sovereignty? Because I think it's quite specific in terms of like it has activism in it, it has like community perspectives in it, has personal context in it, and is really quite indigenous, and it's hard to explain. But are there any folks for you that have been front runners that you've looked up to?
Taika is probably the biggest one. I mean, I've got this story with Bird, where Bird came to I live on the Mille Lacs Band Indian Reservation right now, and Bird came here through an outreach program through Sundance, and came here and showed Sterling's film, and Sterling Harjo's film, and who else was it, Bird?
Andrew McLean.
And Andrew McLean's film, and
Yeah.
it kind of made me realize that you could actually be like a really solid idiosyncratic director, while also bringing like your native thing into it, like your native perspective into it. And I saw that in Taika Waititi's films as well, and that's why I kind of like pointed my path towards Sundance, and eventually I got Bird's attention again after like 6 or 7 years, and then he helped me get all my projects made, or many of my projects made.
For me, definitely Alanis Obomsawin. She was my first exposure to Indigenous filmmaking, and before I found her films as a young woman, I just didn't think we were out there. And so for the beginning of my career, it was all about how do I fit into their way of doing it? How do I get in, as opposed to how do I be who I am and bring what I have? And Alanis was the first for me to say, oh my goodness, wait a second, we are there, and she's doing it. She's telling our stories her way, and so loud and proud about it. So she's an incredible role model, I think, for all of us. And then, I've been in the business for 20 years, and I feel like it's really been a community groundswell that has happened. Because the more of us there are, and the more of this incredible content we're creating, the more we're pushing back. For me, that has really, it's been that wave coming in that you can't ignore a wave coming at you, or you can to your own peril, basically. So for me, these last 10 years, to just see all of this talent and all of this incredible filmmaking, I think all of that has really, really made a massive difference.
Yeah. I'm afraid to answer this question because I'm going to date myself. When I started my career working in media 25 years ago, when I was a funder for the Ford Foundation. And back then, the founders of what our Native American film movement were the ones that I, first interacted with, people like George Bordeaux and Sandy Osawa, the late Phil Lucas. And I recognize also, when I started working for Sundance around the year 2000, about 4 years after that, I first met Merata Mitta, who I realized she had been across, working with, and attending some of these, and with Alanis as well, some of these formational gatherings and meetings when the elders of our film movement were really starting to try to connect internationally and globally, along with Victor Masayesva, and others, who were doing really profound work at the time just by, embracing the camera and attempting to tell cinematic stories. And so I was very fortunate to have grown up in that era, especially in the United States, when our film culture was only in documentary. And I remember being present when it was everybody's goal to take that first foray into fiction filmmaking, which eventually happened in 1998, and on the States side, with Smoke Signals and the other two feature films which premiered at Sundance this same year as Smoke Signals, which was Naturally Native, and Tushka, which are all Native directed. But it was when I first met Merata, I'd understood that back in the 80s, so I think we've come to identify her now as the first Indigenous woman to direct a fiction feature film. And so it's like, I just think it's been so great to have been mentored by her and to witness the relationships that she and Alanis shared, as well as, all these other filmmakers, many of whom have passed now. And so, if we think about, again, the reflection of that angle against 100+ years of cinematic tradition with our elders, many of whom are still with us, it's like, it's still a very new kind of, burgeoning kind of world, I feel like, that is really being reinterpreted and redefined.
Yeah, and just on the back of that, absolutely, Bird. I mean, for us here in Aotearoa, Merata Mitta, she was literally for us the only Māori woman making films that we could consistently rely on for just, oh, wow. A vision and a statement that you just couldn't find anywhere else for us. And it was like you're talking about the documentary space, that definitely was kind of where we often would see ourselves, or the only place. So when she did make Mauri, it was groundbreaking, literally, and it really changed everything. However, the sad fact is there hasn't been another film made by another Māori woman since then. However, thank you for supporting Ainsley and Briar, because now they're making cousins, and that's an incredible, acknowledgement to the relationships that Merata had and has with Bird. And if we don't have that community, how do we maintain our stories to be told? So she was just, oh man, she was so staunch and just such a fighter that you didn't ever want to be on the wrong side of her.
No.
And if I'd love to, be in her presence, there would be drops and pearls of wisdom just happening all the time. And I remember one time we were working on Tammy Davis's film. It was one of the short little films that we played at Sundance, Ebony Society. And I just remember her talking about, there was an issue with the contracting that had happened with that project. And it was sitting with the funders at the time. And there was just some barus going on. And she just said to me, contracts are just there to be argued. And I had, initially thought, oh my God, contracts, we're fucked. And she's just like, no, she was always just like, go back, you take ownership, you know exactly where it comes from. It's in your puku, it's in your gut, and you just start from there. So she was always, she always made you feel like there was possibility. And I think that's kind of one of the things all of us here, especially in Aotearoa, have garnered from her, that there's possibility and there's hope, because she paved that way,
Especially when you have a puku nui. Sorry, speaking Māori.
I like it.
Watch out, you're going to go into
No, but I just really am so proud of our community. It's like I just go back to those early years when people were literally fighting and striving and struggling, especially going back to an era, especially in the United States, with this deep, capitalistic complex that we have, and the way that our filmmaking culture is oriented, and the way that it really kind of informs the rest of the world, which is kind of like this whole, Lyle had to go through this with his feature films. Like, he had to find investors. It's a capitalistic finance model. It's like you have to find money to put into your movie in order for it to get made, with the anticipation and the hope that there's going to be a profit. It's like, and that there's going to be a profit made. I recognize, Chelsea and Tracy, you're living in much more equitable countries that actually believe in this, notion that we don't have in the States, which is public support for the arts, And so those are really complicating factors, going back to, contracts and financial relationships and addition. I think there's so many more elements of entrepreneurialism that so many of our filmmakers have to have when they're trying to get their work made and seen, given, how also theatrical and distribution worlds are shifting right now. So I think it's amazing that we're transcending all of that, given those, colonial realities.
Well, I'm definitely not surprised. I feel like, what apocalypse? We've survived so many. I don't even, at this point, there's no point in counting. I was wondering if you could maybe, I really liked some of the points that you were bringing up around, how around ownership, around trying to get your momentum behind your work. And if anyone could speak to, how do you remain to have control, or when you're bringing other people in, whether it's for collaboration artistically or with producers, do you bring a set of values in terms of collaboration with you, or what's the best approach that you found in terms of trying to gain momentum for your projects?
I guess it depends on the actual project, right? For example, I'm making a documentary and arts film at the moment, and I know that there's not much money for documentaries as such, and also, talking about the public model, which is great, and we're really, really grateful we have that. That means that everyone's fighting for that public money too. So one of the wonderful things I think I learned from maybe living in the States for a little while and being around Burden and understanding about how it works there in terms of philanthropy, is now actually kind of trying to bring that back to New Zealand and figure out what other partnerships can we bring in to our filmmaking world that maybe have been exposed before. So it's actually quite nice. We can kind of get to be able to share all these, ways in which that we work. And so at the moment, I'm trying to get money from, I guess, the arts patrons. And to be fair, it's the rich white people that have got this money that they don't know what to do with it. And so instead of them buying a piece of art that they're just going to put on their wall and maybe no one will ever see, it's like, how would you like to participate in something that everyone will see and that you will be part of, the process? And to be fair, a lot of them are like, oh, wow, I've never thought of that. So it's just changing people's mindsets about how they could participate, and even actually bringing people in, because sometimes, when we're going through this kind of, decolonizing process, there are good allies and they're just not sure what to do or how to navigate that space. And so it's quite good for us to just be open and say, look, you are welcome to come into this space, but he whakaaro aho. It's like, it's my thoughts, it's my process. You can come into my space, please, but you can listen and participate, and I think there are people out there that do want to do that. that's from a funding perspective. But I think if you're bringing people on board, again, like I try really hard to make sure I'm employing Māori crew for whatever kind of project I'm making, just first and foremost to build capacity. And that's just going basically back on what Merita was doing all the time. She was always trying to build capacity. And if we don't have that capacity, then we don't have that forward momentum of all of us going together. So just little things like that, really. Building community, make sure that and then when you do bring someone in, make sure they're valued and that they're part of that decision-making process too. It's all about valuing everyone's participation for me.
I've been approached over the last year by a number of companies, of producers. I mean, especially now with narrative sovereignty being on the table, and especially in Canada, I don't think you can access any of its public. They better not. I don't think any of the public institutions are going to back projects that are completely produced, written, and directed by white people that are about Indigenous subject matter. So what has resulted is a lot of these projects, a lot of these production companies or these writers I've been approached, and I'm being given a project that is fully, completely developed and being asked to come on board as a director. But really the heart and soul and what I could bring to it has already been predetermined outside of any meaningful Indigenous involvement. And for sure, coming on as a director, there's some influence, but really when I read some of these scripts, it's just so bad. It's just not good at all. So when I have somebody come to me with just the seed of an idea to say, we're looking to collaborate, we're looking to bring somebody on, and together we'll grow this project, that for me absolutely has to be the starting point. But to come to me with something fully developed, it's just not going to fly. So that's definitely sort of a line in terms of this collaborative world. And in terms of who I'm going to work with or who I'm hiring, for me, a whole lot of it is about energy and having our hearts in the right places. And you find that out by sitting with them, talking with them and not about their resume, about life, about their dreams, about what makes them angry. And that's how I like to try to find the people who will work together, because we're going to be aligned. And it really is such a special process to create. That energy all has to be on the same page. So that's how I pursue it.
And how about you, Lyle? Do you have any?
Sorry, I was muted.
It has to happen once.
Yeah, I don't really remember the question exactly, but I can kind of talk to what we were talking, or what they were talking about. I don't know. I fell in love with movies first before I ever even engaged with trying to put my culture on screen. So I always feel like when I'm making movies, I kind of, it's going to sound like pretentious, but I always approach it with the form of making movies first. And as a writer, I always write about myself, and I live on a reservation. Both my parents grew up on reservations, so it just, all that kind of comes in, and that's the world that I explore. So it just kind of comes out. But in terms of what others are doing with Indigenous stories, I think there's a lot of well-meaning work out there, and I think that the more that we support people who, Native filmmakers who are very into the form of making movies, really knowledgeable about the film, about making films, that the more that we will find our way into those positions and be able to really affect the way that people see natives in the cinematic vocabulary, or out in the world.
And I had a quick question actually around sort of, and maybe Bird, I'll start with you with this one. You know, I've been in Imagineia for just over a year. And the one thing I think, just in response to narrative sovereignty, that I'm seeing from the submissions is that there are distinct aesthetics, there are distinct story styles that are coming from different nations. And you can kind of start to see this percolating of a visual language. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak to some of the things that you're seeing as part of your role at Sundance and the network that you're a part of what's sort of coming around in regards to narrative sovereignty and in Indigenous cinema.
Wow. How much time do we have? Well, yeah, I think you're touching on something that's always fascinated me. I think since kind of like some of my earlier times of being a curator for Sundance Film Festival is really kind of like, you know, because Sundance, you know, we're a nonprofit organization. We exist outside the film industry. We're in this realm of independent film. You know, it's kind of like we recognize that there is an American industry which is really rooted in a particular, you know, way of working and a style of storytelling that has really trained audiences around the world in terms of how they consume stories, mm-hmm. right? And so, and then also, you know, in relationship to the narrative sovereignty piece, you know, it's like there's definitely predatory behavior by that industry on our stories. You know, we have continually been mined, we have continually been, you know, preyed upon, you know, and to create kind of, you know, a canon of cinema that is really inauthentic about us. And so the work that I've been very fortunate to do at Sundance is really to be able to empower, you know, emerging filmmakers and people who are really trying to do something distinct and authentic and unique and really encourage them to give it kind of a cultural inflection, like you're saying, you know, where we can start to recognize that, you know, that even within, you know, an idea of American cinema or world cinema, that there are distinct kind of Ojibwe cinemas, you know, Maori cinemas, you know, Apache cinemas or Navajo cinemas. And you really can kind of tell sometimes structurally, you know, reading and looking at work, like Lyle's saying, going back to the form of things, of being, so if you're literate in forms of storytelling other than, you know, especially outside of American storytelling styles, you know, whether it's Japanese cinema or whether it's, you know, French New Wave and all of these other kind of traditions of cinema, you can start to understand that cinema is a tool and a language that can be reinterpreted and reapproached from, you know, from a distinct, authentic point of view, and especially an Indigenous one. And so I'm really proud of the work that we at Sundance have done, I think, to really fan those flames, to push filmmakers to not just make cookie cutter films that are really rooted in a typical 3-act narrative structure, you know, and very basic, you know, kind of Western canons of what cinema is, because ultimately, you know, cinema is, you know, it's a Western, you know, tool, right? Mm-hmm. It was created under, you know, a very European context, and I think the more that we decolonize that and restructure it, I think the best is really kind of yet to come in terms of what Indigenous stories will be and the influence that they will have, you know, on an industry. But at the same time, we have to be aware, because the more that happens, the higher the level of predatory behavior is going to continue to be. And so that's why it's really important for us to keep pushing forward this narrative sovereignty conversation, and also to continue to protect our communities from being mined, because, you know, people like to use a lot of tools and distractions and shiny objects coming for our Native people, you know, with promises of celebrity and fame, for us to sign away rights to intellectual property. And it's dangerous, you know, it's really, really dangerous out there. And so we really have to be conscious and cautious of how we proceed and present our films. And thankfully, you know, we have the TIFFs of the world, we have the Sundances of the world. But I do worry about, you know, once we start to kind of really penetrate, you know, this more capitalistic model of filmmaking with Indigenous stories, because it's going to happen. It is happening.
And so I guess just off of that, like how, and for everyone here, like what ways do you think we can hold the institution or the industry accountable? What are some accountability that maybe we can expect, or what that you hope to see in the upcoming years as like more folks are out there making work, and what are the possibilities, I guess, with that?
Well, I know that Canada, you guys have created some great protocols, you know, that, and I think, Chelsea, are there Maori protocols for industry in Aotearoa? Because I know it really started with Australia, with Dr. Terry Janke, who created Australian protocols, you know, for their film industry. But, you know, I think it's something we need in the States.
Yeah, there's been different levels for sure, and there's now just recently a Rotaki Māori scheme that's part of the New Zealand Film Commission, which is something new that has, you know, hopefully it's very new, so it hasn't had a lot of time to make a big impact yet, but I'm sure it will. And but yeah, it's a hard one, because you still, to be honest, in our country, you still have Pākehā producers actually taking intellectual property of Māori stories and being able to tell those. That is dangerous, and I applaud you, Bird, for bringing up that point. It's really, really dangerous, because if we don't have that control of that IP, then you have no control about what's going to happen with that story and beyond, and where it's going to go. And we've seen instances of that happen in the past with our cinema, so we do need to be vigilant. It's really important that we support one another as a community. But yeah, it's definitely a scary place to be, you're right, because the more we commodify things, the less control we possibly are going to have. So perhaps, you know, when we think about the value of something, that we all need to share and what that value is, rather than perhaps the whole model needs to change, because the funding also in our country, and it's similar to Canada, I guess, in that we have that film commission thing, is that you are kind of expected to return a profit. It's really hard to return a profit for cinema, for sure. But you kind of have all these measurements against you already, and you got to prove who is your audience, and prove all these kinds of things that are in the future that are going to perhaps make money. But then you're also kind of giving away your relationships that you have with your community that perhaps have never even been explored or given the right to participate in that filmmaking anyway, which I think is why a lot of our Indigenous language cinema has not been able to progress as much as we would like, because the so-called funders will say, well, who's your target audience? Where are you going to get the money from? Where's it going to come back from? And if your distributor can't say to you, who are mainly white, if they can't say to you, oh, this audience exists, because they don't have a relationship with real Māori speaking communities, how do they even know that exists? And that was a great thing we proved with Moana Reo Māori when we did the Te Reo Māori version. We sold 3 times more of that film in the DVD space and than they did in the Pākehā version, you know? Like, we have an audience that exists. So it's this real, it's almost like the funding model kind of needs to be reimagined and changed, and it needs to allow space for us to have, yes, that authenticity right to the very end. We're an audience that exists, Te Reo Māori, and all the Indigenous people on this panel today, you've all got your own beautiful languages and communities and people that deserve to hear their own stories. And that's that is a community and an audience that hasn't yet had their opportunity to participate.
Yeah, and we need, so within our community, I think we're all very solid on where we are and what we need. And I just think that it's our bigger industry that we need buy-in and partnership on. So we have the protocol and pathways here. I think we've all been naturally doing it within our own work, and now it's guiding others. But we need them to buy in, to understand it, to respect it, and to enforce it in all of their institutions. And I do think right now in Canada, we are at a period where I'm hopeful, but I really do think that transition is about to happen. I really hope that we've seen the last round of Indigenous subject matter films being made completely by white teams. I think so. I think.
Well, I did want to point out also protocol-wise, I know the Sami negotiated really interesting terms, you know, with the Frozen 2 animated film with Disney, which was pretty groundbreaking, especially on the state corporate side within United States. And I think it's definitely a model that I think was really is really something to be contemplated. But in the States, there are still, like, I know Leo DiCaprio is really putting forth Killers of the Flower Moon, which is going to be a really big, picture that Apple is producing with Marty Scorsese directing. And that is based on, Osage murder stories from, the early 1900s, which will be significant. So, there's still encroachment happening.
Yeah.
I think there's still a lot of work in the States that has to happen.
A lot.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
And Lyle's going to change it all, right, Lyle? Because I'm going to retire soon.
I like that. We have a couple more minutes before we go to questions. Is there anything that anyone wanted to bring up that we haven't touched upon yet before we get into the questions at all?
Well, depending on who's out there listening, I think, if you've tuned in to figure out, what is narrative sovereignty, like if that is your very basic question, one thing I want to say to all the creators and all the producers out there is that if your interest in our story comes strictly from the point of view of like, oh, I never heard that before. Oh, that's so interesting. That should not be the ground for you to then take off on that story. That should never be the reason of like, this is such a great idea. I never heard about it. I want to share it. If that ever occurs to you, that is a big old no. So walk away. I want to say that.
And
there's one more minute. Somebody else?
I think that's something you touched upon that like we never talk about, is like sort of a humble, like there's a sort of humbleness also that comes along with narrative sovereignty. I think that people don't talk about, and humble protocol and the ability to say no, like this is not a project for me. This relationship to the story is also not appropriate for me, and I have to be able to own that. And I think that's okay. Like I've been definitely told, I thought this person would be great on the story, and they were like, no, it's not for me. I think you should go to this person. And I thought that was really quite a great moment, not only for me to learn, but also to like get deeper to the connection about what we're talking about, or what is our point in our relation to that story. And I think that's really great that you brought that up. Okay, so I'm going to go to our first question here from Joe Conrad. So Joe's asking, are native languages and their revitalization a crucial component for authenticity?
Maybe.
Yes, but I don't know that it's only that. I think our stories could be told in English as well, but in order to keep our languages thriving, I think putting them, as Chelsea said, in our stories so that they last and we are able to share them, it's amazing. It's an amazing thing.
I think it really goes back to kind of the intent of why somebody is making, a piece of work or a film, and the intention of who the audience is, because I see a lot of community-based filmmaking projects that are documentary or even fiction that are really only solely meant to serve the community, and then there are those that are, much more intended for broader audiences. And then I think they have a tendency to try to navigate, that the cultural presentation a bit more. But, I think that it's always that going back to what I was saying earlier, kind of at the heart of this level of cultural inflection that I think an artist or a filmmaker wants to, embed within their storytelling. And it can vary. But I think Indigenous languages are important, bottom line.
Sorry, go ahead, Chelsea.
Oh, just, it is just a matter of survival no matter what. And we're all kind of coming out of and trying to then push forward post, colonization. Part of that is maintaining language and culture. You kind of can't go one without the other. It's a lot of work to do, eh? Like everyone is trying to maintain, because along with all the beautiful language is knowledge. And there's so much knowledge that is intrinsic and steeped in within particular language that it's just sometimes you can't even say the same thing in English that you want to try and say or express in your own native language. So for sure, it's vital. But yep, as other panelists have talked about, it's not the only other thing, because sometimes you just feel like you're just treading water all the time. Like, I'm just getting through this. I'm just getting through this.
So we can go to the next question from Marie-Francois Theodore. Does the emergence of streaming help with reaching audiences that may have been harder to access before, or that were not counted as viable? Like overseas audience that often want to see your stories but aren't often considered. Has streaming helped with that, or is there much difference?
Oh, 1000% streaming has helped. You know, if we take Hippie Mitter's film Mera Te Mete How Mum Decolonized the Screen, if Ava DuVernay didn't pick that film up, it's a really hard thing to get a documentary out into the world. So she's a direct line with Netflix. You know straight away that your film is going to be on a platform that is worldwide, international. And so she changed that film. She changed everything for the exposure and for the world maybe to understand or even hear about Merata. As she even said herself at the screening, I didn't know about this woman. Everyone should know about this woman. Like, she was so, you know, she really meant it. And it was wonderful to hear that even Tulane Jones, who's the VP of Array now, saying when she was watching that film, she was hearing the exact same things that would come out of Ava's mouth to her community that Merata was saying. So it was like, wow, you know, like making those connections. But yes, I absolutely, streaming without a doubt has opened up the world.
I think just what they're commissioning as well. The streamers are not afraid of very specific stories from specific communities, where I think the broadcast world for so long has been. So I think that that's also changed the game.
Well, I think especially now, living in the global pandemic that we're living in, where, you know, I definitely, you know, one of the things, the trends you do see business-wise, you know, here in the States specifically, is like there's more and more streamers that are launching, you know, and that there seem to be some of the biggest buyers, as you know, as production is trying to resume. But yeah, definitely, I feel like, you know, tribal communities, indigenous communities definitely do have a bit more access to what's being streamed, more so than they do traditionally theaters. Lyle and I actually met on the Mille Lacs Reservation, which is one of the few tribal reservations in the States that has a movie theater on their reservation. You know, that's why we went there, wanted to go there and do a public program. How many years ago was that? I
was like 15, I think. So it was like 15 years ago. Yeah.
And I was 18, so that was just 10 years ago.
You just are really, you love Indigenous history.
Oh, wow.
Art history. Okay, so we have a couple more questions. There's quite a few actually, so I hope we can get through them. But I have one from Roger Boyer. What are some actions Indigenous creators can take in order to keep their narrative sovereignty? We touched a little bit on it before, but if there's any more tips.
Definitely. Well, I think we touched on it. It's finding the right partners is key. So if you're not able to partner up with other Indigenous people, let's say, because you don't have to stay in that bubble. I think collaboration between us is fantastic, but it's finding the right partners who will not be trying to change your story or push you in the direction they want because they've been working longer or they know more, or you need to find a partner who's right behind you and who wants to lift you and your story up, not take.
I think somebody who has a really great articulation of this is Elamaya Tailfeathers, you know, who's a Sami Blackfeet filmmaker. And, you know, she did a presentation recently for us at Sundance for one of our workshops, where she really kind of articulated and broke down kind of like her own method of decolonizing, you know, the process around her creating her feature film, which was The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open, which was also distributed by Array, by Ava DuVernay's company, and given a global platform on Netflix. But her whole process around how she built cultural competency, how she created a bit more of an equitable, production model, kind of trying to decrease the hierarchical method of filmmaking, to really kind of the way that she centers Indigenous, story, world, character, point of view, and everything goes against every kind of I feel like colonial thread of the way that a film is made. And I think that she should definitely be given a broader exposure on that method of how she created that film, because it was definitely something that I thought was completely innovative, and also a new trend. I think that most of our Indigenous filmmakers could really learn from, to create their own models of production.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to go to Christopher Bautista. I have a question regarding the lack of visibility in film of the intersectionality between First Nation stories and Black stories. Specifically, how many Black people in the States have Indigenous roots, myself included? So I think, maybe that intersectionality, if anyone has seen some of those questions happening, I think in terms of for Canada and for us, just visibility is so important. There's a lot of Mi'kmaq Black histories that often don't get talked about. But if anyone wants to speak to perhaps in the States around that.
Well, Lyle, I you know what? I want to reference a documentary that Tracy made, going back to one of her early documentaries about tribal enrollment in her community, becoming a member of a band, or being a tribal citizen, being an enrolled member of a tribe. We have these complicating colonial structures in our tribal communities that have been imposed upon us about blood quantum and about tribal enrollment, that really kind of that authenticate, a level of indigeneity that has been, like I said, historically imposed on us. And so I feel like what we're learning more and more, I think, especially during the moment of Black Lives Matter, this racial reckoning that we're experiencing in the United States and elsewhere. Somebody's house is on fire. Hopefully it's not mine. But we're recognizing the value of allyship and allies, cross-cultural allies, multi-ethnic, multiracial allies, people who lie across the spectrum given, their ethnic identity. And it's something that has such great value, I think, as we're trying to build these movements, not only Black Lives Matter, but narrative sovereignty and all these other, interrelated movements, which are all kind of a result of, of us pushing back against, colonial history, and forced domination of our lands, and the erasure of Indigenous peoples and cultures as a way to, sustain, these colonial nations that exist. And so I think it's really important. And I think it's just further complicated by these ongoing, imposed structures. And so I welcome allyship. I welcome, ongoing, collaborations across the spectrum of intersectionality, because I think it only benefits all of our movements ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually, a great space to end on, and just in terms of collectivity, intersectionality, nation to nation. And I think that's a really great moment. So thank you so much for being a part of the panel today. Narrative sovereignty, and everyone doing such great work where in your homelands, and also for us to watch on the screen. At Imaginate, we totally enjoy how every one of you have been a part of our family. And thank you so much for sharing your perspectives today.
And be sure to watch Imaginate.
Yes.
Thank you for having us.
Kia ora.
Thank you.
Bye.